Welcome everybody to the preparing for the virtual MPI at UofT. So today's presentation is focused on the MPI. So we're looking at, not MMI, but the multiple panel interview today with the University of Toronto. We do offer other webinars for Casper and other parts of the application cycle. If you want access to those, please give us an email and we will gladly send it to you. And if you've been to our previous webinars for other medical schools, we have additional content today exclusive to the University of Toronto. We're going to have a rapid fire tip section on 12 plus health and ethics topics at the end, which are not included in any of our other presentations, along with a revised pro tip section. And about me, I'm a medical student at the Mayo Clinic Alex School of Medicine in Rochester, Minnesota. The Mayo Clinic is the #1 hospital in the world. I applied to both Canadian and US medical schools. This cycle, I got into both, well, this past cycle. And before that, I only applied to Canadian medical schools and I did not get in. So I applied basically 2 cycles, and the second time I got into both US and Canadian schools. I also have non-traditional backgrounds and experiences. And Ron is a first-year medical student, like I said, at the University of Toronto, applied 1 time to medical school, got in that first time. So very stellar applicant, did his biology undergrad at York University. Ron, you want to unmute, introduce yourself a little bit?
Hey, how's it going, guys? I can confidently say that med school is definitely a more peaceful journey right now than undergrad, at least for Canadian med school students. I don't know how Kevin's experiencing it, but yeah, I hope you guys find this seminar helpful and stick around to the end. I'll have some personal tidbits and other things my fellow UofT peers have told me about. So hope it's going to help.
Amazing. Thank you, Ron. And thank you again to everybody for joining us on your Sunday evenings. So really the focus of this presentation is the secret to the panel interview, or the difference between great answers and extraordinary answers. That is going to be the thesis of this presentation, and I will walk you through it. So the UofT is a multiple panel interview, of course, on a variety of topics. It can even be personal questions, and it's asynchronous. So you can complete your interview fairly quickly if you wish. You have optional breaks. You have 4 independent interviews, of course, and these are all in your emails. Last year, it was 3 minutes to read and plan your answer. From the website this year, it says 2 minutes, so that might have been a modification. And again, you have 5 minutes to answer, and you can't review your notes, right? You can plan those in those minutes that you're reading, but you can't go and review your notes and be like, oh, I think that the health system in Canada, you can't do that. So practice with this format to prepare for success. Okay, and a big thing is paying attention to hot topics. All right, the opioid epidemic, homelessness, barriers to care. This is a great list, and let me tell you right now, we're going to be sending you these slides after the presentation ends, so don't bother taking notes or anything. Just sit back, relax, and absorb this material. This presentation is also recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube promptly, usually within 24 hours. So relax, just understand this material, and you'll be great. So there are a lot of topics, of course, that could appear on your interview and appear every single year. And these are a lot of them. But here's where things start getting different. You need to look at these topics and not only be able to understand how to, what's going on, right? Like, what are the statistics on, for example, medical assistance in dying in Canada, right? The laws changed in 2021, and now they're being expanded to things that are not only terminal illnesses, maybe being expanded in the future to mental health illnesses, and so on and so forth. So it's cool to know these facts, and they're going to be very vital in helping you build compelling arguments and compelling points of view that you're going to say in your interview. But you also need to be able to provide an expert opinion on these topics. So I applied, again, 2 times to medical school, and I interviewed 2 times. The first year I applied, I interviewed at McMaster in Ottawa. And I got rejected after interviewing at those schools. I got waitlisted at both and then rejected. And that was a year where I would study all these topics, and I would have very expert opinions on these topics, these hot topics. And the difference was, the second year, I started thinking a bit outside of the box, right? The first year, I'm like, all right, healthcare topics. We can look into Indigenous health, and I would craft these expert opinions and be able to deliver them to the camera in a very, very compelling manner. But I wouldn't think about things like AI in healthcare. I wouldn't think about things like the wealth gap, cancel culture, housing in Ontario, mid-level providers. These are all topics that are adjacent to medicine, sometimes not even relevant to medicine. Sometimes you could get in your interview a weird question like, is war good or bad? That's been in Canadian interviews. Now, I'm not going to say which ones, but I was like studying for, you can imagine the first time I applied, I was studying for questions like organ donation and medical assistant dying. And then I'd get a question on like cancel culture. And I'd be like, man, I spent all this time looking at organ donation. I just got a question on cancel culture. And it really threw me off. So it really comes down to being able to look at society as a whole, not only looking at health topic issues, but being able to understand, what's going on with the housing crisis, because these are things that are adjacent. These, if they affect everybody, then it becomes a matter of public health. And that's where you need to start looking to get the wide understanding of diverse topics you need for your interviews. So this is a great list. This first and second pages, these are great lists of topics you should know for your interviews, and I would spend some time with them. So I think the best way to practice is always to do an example question together, the best way to understand how to answer these questions. So let's look at this. Imagine you're a physician and you encounter a patient with chronic pain who requests opioid medication. How would you balance the need for effective pain management with the risk of opioid addiction? All right, so this is a question you could be asked on your interview. And now, let's look at an answer to this, okay? To answer this question on opioid addiction, you could say, I would conduct a comprehensive assessment of the patient's pain, right? When did the pain start? How does it radiate? What's the pain like? Have open conversations with the patient about their pain experience and treatment history. Okay, you talk to them, what have you done so far about this pain? Then you could say, if opioids are necessary, I would proceed with caution, starting at the lowest dose to avoid dependence. I would revise a treatment plan with the patient periodically, which means I would regularly review it and adjust as needed, and then you can give a conclusion. Now, I want someone in the chat, and I promise you I will not go to the next slide until one person either in the chat just says yes or no, is this a good answer? Or just speak up, unmute. Do you all think this is a good answer or not to this question? I personally think this is a good answer, and this is the sort of answer that I would have given in my first year of interviewing. The first year I got interviews at Canadian schools, I would give these, I think pretty solid answers, if I do say so myself, that address all the main points of the question. And it's a very mature answer. It's something that maybe even a clinician would say. However, let's see what else we could do, all right? What if we also said, I could first explore a multidisciplinary approach to treating pain? For example, physiotherapy, lifestyle modifications, exercise, diet. I would educate the patient about the risks of opioid use and how we can minimize these risks to build a trusting doctor-patient relationship. And then what if we go even farther? What if we make connections to the opioid crisis? Every major metropolitan center in Canada is dealing with an opioid crisis, and not just the metropolitan centers, but the Northern Territories and many other places. What if we talked about the sickle cell disease and its relevance to racism? For instance, did you know that a lot of the times when Black individuals, especially young Black individuals, come to the emergency rooms and they're in pain, they want opioids to treat their pain, a lot of the times the physicians might think, this person just wants opioids and is here just for opioids. But in reality, sickle cell disease is something that affects the Black population disproportionately due to genetic variants. And a lot of the times this is underdiagnosed or overlooked and causes Black individuals a lot of pain and causes these dilemmas. Maybe you could talk about specific medical cases that are relevant to Canada or Ontario. Maybe you could talk about the science of opioid addiction. For example, I took a course on cell biology. You could talk about, reuptake. Of course, you wouldn't spend too much time on this, but you could briefly mention it as just like another perspective. You could maybe you've done street medicine. You've been on the streets and you've administered naloxone, and you've seen, strategies for safe administration, and so on. Maybe you can mention that. These are the things that take this great answer and make it an extraordinary answer. And this is what I started doing the second year that I interviewed. The second year that I interviewed, not only did I have expert opinions, right? Not just expert knowledge, but an ability to articulate my ideas about these topics and the topics that are beyond, but I would be able to make these extended connections that helped me go from a great answer to an extraordinary answer, okay? So, by the way, these questions are all coming from our website, thebrightdoctor.com or brightstudent.org, and this one is particularly from our opioid crisis question bank. All the answers that you see, along with tips to go beyond and red flags to avoid, are on our website. For example, you could have even mentioned things about the use of prescription drug monitoring programs. For example, Ontario and all the provinces have opioid stewardship programs where they track physicians and how much they're prescribing opioids, to make sure that things are in line and we're not overprescribing opioids where we don't have to. So now, why do we need to provide extraordinary answers? Why can't we just give those stellar answers that address the question in a mature manner, like I did my first year? And this is because there's what, 600 and something people interviewing at the University of Toronto. All of you have worked incredibly hard. All of you deserve that seat, right? You've maintained a stellar GPA. You've probably done great on your MCAT, right? I know UofT doesn't need it. You've worked on your essays. You've perfected your essays. You have amazing extracurricular activities. So all of you are brilliant. But if the class size is 200 and something people, you need to be part of that top 1/3, part of that top 1/2 of interviewees. So when everybody's saying the same thing, you need to be able to stand out. And the way I started looking at it the second year I applied is like this metaphor. You can see these people pushing these blocks, right? While this individual is like carving the block into a sphere. And maybe if these individuals are looking back, they think, oh, look at this dumb guy doing like nothing, right? He's still on square one. Or maybe this person will look ahead and think the others are ahead, right? And here's where it connects to you. The first year I applied, everybody was listening to the same podcast. What is it? The CMAJ, the Canadian Medical, the CMAJ podcast, the White Coat Black Art podcast. People were reading Doing Right. They were reading books, if you could believe it. I never read that book. I have listened to those podcasts, and listen, these are probably phenomenal resources. I have nothing against those resources. But if everybody's doing the exact same thing, if everyone is preparing for their interviews in the exact same way, how are you going to deliver opinions and expert ideas that others are not? It really just becomes like who can communicate the best, and then how other factors in your application can stand out. That's the way I interpret it, at least. So the second year, I will tell you what I started doing differently. Instead of listening to those podcasts, instead of those books, what I did differently to be able to provide opinions that really went above and beyond. And though after my second cycle of applying to medical school, which was very successful, I really came down to these 5 ways that you can stand out. And then this might be one of the most important slides in the entire presentation. It's either you address more perspectives than others. It's either you give more alternative solutions than other people, right? Which can even include how do you avoid certain issues in the future. Maybe you're a better speaker than others. You're more personable. You have more organized answers. You say less ums and ahs. And you can look at the camera and speak with confidence. You can make connections to your personal life, to your future career. So for example, with that opioid question, maybe you could have said, I've done training in naloxone administration. So that could have been a connection to your personal life. And you can demonstrate specific domain knowledge, like you could have talked about the science of opiates. And lastly, explaining why. I know people who will go into interviews and have like the coolest, craziest ideas. Oh, we should make an app to do this or a website to do this. But they won't explain why. Well, why would an app be effective in addressing this problem? And I bolded this point, looking at the camera and speaking with confidence, because of this guy, Smart Alec. All of us know a smart Alec, okay? This is the person in your class, guy or gal, that just speaks condescendingly to others, speaks like they know everything, and a lot of the times they're just talking like rubbish. They're not really saying anything worth saying, or sometimes they're just plain out wrong, flat out wrong. The thing is, a smart aleck can look in a screen, look at the camera, and speak with confidence. They can tell you the average length of a giraffe's neck is 20 feet, and you'll believe them, right? Even though I just made that up, I have no clue how long a giraffe's neck is. You need to be able to talk like the smart aleck, because these people, and I've seen them in medical schools, all right? These people do make it far just from the pure ability to look in the camera and speak with confidence. So now you, with your brilliant answers, your well-researched answers, you're not out here capping, you're not making stuff up. You need to look at the screen and make sure your point gets across. Okay. So other questions I get: should you speak for the full time? Typically, no, if it's a synchronous interview. But when it's asynchronous and you have 5 minutes and there's no one else across, no follow-up questions, then yes, you have 2 minutes to think. You need to use that to find a way to give an expert answer and be able to talk for at least the whole thing. And lastly, should you go in depth or broad? So this is like, should I address like 1 or 2 ideas very deeply? Or should I kind of just mention a lot of ideas so they understand, I'm looking at all these perspectives. And my personal opinion is I would talk about 1 or 2 ideas deeply, but either at the beginning or near the end, I would acknowledge other points of view that maybe I didn't have the time to discuss, or that maybe were not my point of view if it's like an opinion question, okay? So if there's any questions, okay, Michael has a question. Do they like answers such as, I believe we should start with acetaminophen and ibuprofen combination to treat the chronic pain before we escalate to opioid medication? Do we give bonus points for giving detailed medical answers? So Michael, thank you for your question. The way I would phrase it is not like, I believe we should start with, because you actually don't have any clue what the patient's pain is, right? They can have allergies, but I like that idea. You could say, maybe we can start with more mild forms, right? More mild forms of addressing the patient's pain. For example, Tylenol and ibuprofen. And you could address it like that, right? In addition to the other, more holistic ways that we mentioned: exercise, diet, and so on and so forth. So I would be a little bit less direct. We should start with this because, you don't know what the patient is doing. Maybe if they have like, gastric cancer and you can't give acetaminophen, but I would say maybe we can do this. So it really shows the same amazing thinking that you're doing, but in a less like, in a less troubling way. Because if you just say something straight up, then it can be like, okay, well, maybe we can't do that. Okay. So thank you for your question. All right. If no one has any other questions, we're going to start with the next practice question. How does the Ontario health system address the needs of Indigenous populations, and what improvements can be made? All right, I'll give you all a second to think about, ideas that you would have said in this answer. All right, let's take a look. So let's skip the main idea and look at this introduction sentence. The Ontario health system has made efforts to address the unique healthcare needs of Indigenous populations, though there are still significant areas for improvement. So this is a beautiful introductory sentence because it actually tells you how your answer is going to be organized. You're going to first talk about what the Ontario health system has done, and then you're going to go to what are the significant areas for improvement. And if you don't tell them, like, for example, significant areas of improvement, then your interviewer or whoever's assessing it is just going to be like, yo, what's going on? But this is a perfect, it's a very subtle way of organizing your answer, and I will give you other ways to organize your answers very soon. One way the system addresses these needs is through culturally sensitive care. This involves providing healthcare services that respect and incorporate Indigenous cultural practices, beliefs, and values. For example, some healthcare facilities in Ontario can have integrated traditional health healing practices alongside conventional medical treatments, recognizing the importance of holistic care that encompasses physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being. So this is beautiful. Right off the bat, we're talking about what Ontario is doing, and obviously this person has either been volunteering or they've been part of the community, And that is shown because they can talk. Some healthcare facilities in Ontario have integrated healing practices, integrated traditional healing practices. Just by saying that, it conveys that you've been in some, in the environment, you've been at hospitals, working with different populations, working with maybe Indigenous populations, and that you've done your research, okay? So without talking about your extracurriculars, you've already conveyed that. Next, the Ontario government has also made efforts to improve access to healthcare for Indigenous communities. This includes funding for programs and services specifically designed for Indigenous populations, such as the Aboriginal Health Access Centers, which offer a range of health and wellness services. Beautiful. We're mentioning specific things that Ontario is offering. The Aboriginal Health Access Centers. This shows an expert level understanding of, okay, what does Ontario provide to this vulnerable population? However, and this is where we start the second part, right? We said we're going to talk about the areas for improvement. However, there are still notable gaps and challenges. One major issue is the accessibility of services, especially for those in remote or rural Indigenous communities. These areas often lack adequate healthcare facilities and professionals, leading to significant disparities in health outcomes. Another area for improvement is the training and education of healthcare professionals in Indigenous health. While some progress has been made, there's a need for more comprehensive and mandatory training on cultural competence and historical factors and social factors that impact the health of Indigenous peoples. Beautiful. We've highlighted not only things that Ontario is doing, and now we're going into what are the areas for improvement. This shows critical thinking. And now look what we're going to do at the end. This is going to help us go above and beyond, because everyone's going to either address the question and what improvements can be made, right? So we just addressed the entire question in these first 4 body paragraphs. Look at this last part of this answer. Furthermore, there's a need for greater involvement of Indigenous communities in the planning and delivery of healthcare services. This could be achieved through more meaningful partnerships and collaboration with Indigenous leaders and organizations, ensuring that healthcare initiatives are community-driven and responsive to their specific needs. This is absolutely beautiful, because now you're saying, all right, we're making all these laws, right? We're trying to help this population. We need to get the leaders of these communities in the decision-making rooms and perform shared decision-making with one another, which, by the way, is a CanMed value. So if you've noticed, this answer actually incorporates CanMeds, but in a very mature way that's not like, we're going to engage in shared decision-making. Well, you can say that as well, but it's incorporated in this answer in multiple ways without being, overly explicit or overly forced. You're showing your maturity, you're showing your thinking, and you give them more by giving them this really cool idea. All right, so as a recap, we demonstrate relevant knowledge of Ontario policies. We have a multifaceted way of addressing topic, and we present innovative ideas at the end. And if we look at what other stuff we could have said, for example, we could have mentioned, we could increase investment in healthcare infrastructure for remote Indigenous communities. We could develop healthcare policies that specifically address the social determinants of health affecting Indigenous populations, right? So there's even more things we could have said to go beyond. And let's look at red flags we should avoid it. For example, do not overlook the historical context of Indigenous health disparities, including the impact of colonization and residential schools. So, our question bank comes with all of these ideas to really stand out, because now you can talk about, colonization, residential schools, forced sterilizations. These are all things that have caused mistrust in the Indigenous community, especially with relation to medical care, allopathic medical care. All right, so there's a lot of ways to go beyond, and it's really going to those areas that's going to make you give extraordinary answers that are going to stand out. All right, are there any questions? Now we're going to get to the last part of the presentation on first impressions and personal questions before we go to rapid fire. All right, I don't see any questions. All right, first impressions matter. In the 2 minutes that you're reading, that you're planning your answer, think of the first sentence you're going to say, because that first sentence is your first impression. And I would always say my first few words, or my first, it's usually the organizational sentence where you introduce and how you're going to talk about things. I would say it was sheer confidence, because a lot of people, the camera comes on, they get nervous. Oh, they're looking at themselves, right? It's so unnatural, and they start fumbling. But if you can smile and say your first sentence with utter confidence, you're ahead of everybody. And now let's talk about personal questions, because you could very well be asked a personal question, or it could be a great add-on to your answer that you could include to stand out, okay? When it comes to personal questions, I would have stories about your life that relate to all of these pillars. So these pillars on the left come from the American system, which I actually use even for preparing for the Canadian interviews. But of course, U of T has their own clusters that you can check out on their website. Have a story, 2, 3 stories that connect with every one of these topics. And I have a friend at Queen's University who said he would grab, like, on a Friday night, he'd grab a beer and he'd have one stack of cue cards with like stories about his life and the other one with these CanMed rolls, for example. And he just grab 2 at random and try to make them connect to one another. This is an amazing way to be able to think on your feet, especially when you're asked like a story, name a time you did this, or tell me about when you had to do this, with this kind of community. If you want to be able to think on your feet, that is a great strategy you can use. But at the very least, have 2 to 3 stories for everything. So what is the biggest challenge you've overcome? I've been asked this in so many interviews, okay, US and Canada. And by the way, if you have questions about anything I've done in my life, feel free to ask me at the end. So a question like this would hit overcoming conflict, resilience, capacity for improvement, probably problem solving, and a lot. So stories are usually pretty versatile in what they address. And to answer questions, these personal questions, I use the STAR method, okay? Situation, task, action, result. So for example, let's look at this. Last semester in the McMaster Biology Society, while organizing a programming skills workshop for first-year students, we encountered an unexpected vendor cancellation, leaving us without crucial materials. I was tasked with swiftly finding a replacement vendor without overshooting our budget. So very quickly, I did the S and the T of the STAR method. And I'm highlighting this because S and the T don't get you any points, okay? So obviously this isn't like the biggest challenge you've overcome, right? This is just a challenge. But you can have, and this is what I didn't get the first time I applied. I would spend like half the time just talking about what the situation was. Because these are personal stories that are very meaningful to you, of course, right? You want to give people details. You want to give them, oh, the professor was doing this, and if he he couldn't do this because, on Monday he had this meeting. So whatever, you want to give them all these fruity details to explain, how hard it was and how great of a person you are and how, resourceful you were. But you could even say, I was in the prime minister's office curing cancer. It doesn't matter. It's the A and the R in the STAR method that get you your points, the action and the result. And this is where you show your values. This is where you show your abilities, your skills. Let's look. Consequently, I quickly researched alternative suppliers, assessed their offerings against our needs, and strategically approached the most promising ones to renegotiate terms suitable for our budget. I used strategies like calling suppliers instead of email to ensure rapid communication. Ultimately, we secured the necessary materials under budget, and the workshop went on without a hitch, earning praise from attendees. So beautiful, in a very quick and mature way, you've summarized your entire story, and this shows me that you've spent a lot of time rehearsing your story. Now, the STAR method is missing a letter, and it's a T, okay? And I think I invented this because I've looked online, and I can't find anyone that says STAR method. But there's a missing T, and it stands for takeaway. And where possible, you want to choose either a personal story or a relation to your future profession as your takeaway. I'll show you what this means. Imagine we say the same answer that shows our values, shows our resourcefulness, addresses the question. But then at the end, you say, as I pursue a career in medicine, I will continue to draw on such skills to stay collected in rapidly changing situations. Through strong communication skills, along with problem solving, I will continue to ensure team needs are met for the benefit of my future patients. This is like, wow. Not only did you answer the question in a very effective manner, but you gave them something more. You gave them a takeaway that shows that you've been reflecting on your future career. You understand what medicine is like, because you've connected it, as a physician, as a future physician, I'm going to need these skills. You could even use, as a medical student, I'm going to use these skills. I'm going to collaborate with colleagues in multidisciplinary environments. Everyone's going to have different points of view. This is an amazing way to do a takeaway. And I would actually use like the same takeaway across my interviews because these takeaways are so versatile. Have a takeaway for communication. Have a takeaway for problem solving. Have a takeaway for collaboration. And every single takeaway is like a goodie that you can append to the end of your answer right? You can always give it at the end of your answer, especially if you're running out of ideas. And it's one of those things where you don't even need to like plan it in the 2 minutes, right? So you have 2 minutes to think, but you already know which takeaway you're going to add to this question at the very end, and it's really going to show a mature response and leave a very good final impression. So again, look at the CanMeds items, or look at this list that I really liked. Have stories that reflect your values, perhaps connect to your future career. And here's something no one does. Nobody does this in Canada. And I literally sold this from the American system. So here in the US, there's over 150 medical schools, okay? I know, they're very lucky. We're very lucky here. 150 medical schools. And top applicants will apply to 30 medical schools, get interviews at 20, and get into 10, okay? I know. I don't mean to ruin your Sunday night, but it's the truth. So the medical schools will ask them, well, why do you want to come to this medical school? Because they want to know if they're getting accepted 10 medical schools, they want to know, why should I accept you as well? I don't think maybe you're not committed to me. In Canada, it's different. You're lucky to get a single interview. I mean, you're lucky to get into anywhere, right? So they're not really asking, why do you want to come to this medical school? I've actually seen it asked once in an interview. So you should actually be prepared to answer that. But this is like four interviews in the MPI format. I wouldn't bet on it. But what you could do is, for example, research UofT, research what they have. You could be asked a question like on antibiotic resistance, right? And like, what approach should we use on antibiotic resistance, for example, right? And then you could give your amazing answer. You could do a takeaway. You could talk about your research of antibiotic resistance and whatever. But also you could mention, UofT's antibiotic research. I know UofT has one of the premier labs on antimicrobial resistance research in the nation, on the face of the planet, right? Or maybe you're talking about like the obesity crisis, right? The obesity epidemic. And you can mention how insulin was invented at UofT. These are really cool facts that really personalize your answer. Because when everyone's giving the same answer, they're giving the same answer to these health policy questions, and not only are you connecting it to your life, not only are you connecting it to your future career, but then you personalize it to the school. Well, that is just beautiful. That's like, who is giving those answers? And that's a really, I think, good way to stand out. I just spent one entire day clicking on every tab on UofT's website, okay? All right. Let's go to the rapid fire tips. I promise this would be some new content, not in our previous webinars. So what are other hot topics, and what are things I think people are missing? So that's why I call it common topics, not so common ideas, okay? Organ donation, you could talk about the opt-out versus opt-in model. Some countries work on opt-out, some on opt-in. You can talk about countries like Iran, where there's a marketplace. It's about exploitation and living donors, right? Some people are just donating their organs while they're alive. Homelessness, you could talk about, of course, statistics, but you could also mention complex housing initiatives, especially in Toronto. There's a lot of complex housing and new zoning ideas that are being thrown around, rehabilitation, re-entry to workspace initiatives, and the social determinants of health, of course, of the homeless, medical assistance dying. You can talk about the Canadian law, changes made in 2021, the slippery slope argument, are we going to keep expanding MAID? Are we going to keep expanding it? Where do we stop? Religion, healthcare costs, and patient autonomy. Climate change, if I were you, you could talk about the effects of medicine on climate change. I've been in the operating room. You can see how much waste is generated, for example, in relation to Indigenous health. So, for example, a lot of Indigenous communities take pride and identity in their nature, in their environment. So, if that's going to be ruined by changes in temporal patterns of the globe's climate, then it could really take a toll on their identity. Synthetic biology approaches, I'm going to let y'all research that yourselves. Clean tech and education and research and climate change. Vaccine ethics, talk about the COVID-19 response, especially in Ontario. Shark protests, you can talk about the Emergency Act. There was a lot of news about that recently. Efficacy of vaccines, mistrust in medicine, the science of medicine. You can talk about things like polio, other vaccines. Indigenous health, I talk about colonization, rural health, cultural competency, right? For example, they might believe in the shaman or other spiritual methods of medicine. So sometimes you need to bring in a cultural liaison into the healthcare setting to kind of mediate talks and find a compromise, a good middle ground to provide them optimal care. residential schools, and again, there's social determinants of health. 6 more. It's Christmas. Yeah, I think these are amazing tips, honestly. I don't know anybody else. I don't know where else to find a list of tips like this. Okay, housing, I talk about housing crisis, obviously, international investments, vacancy tax, homelessness, the economy, immigration, and its effects on housing. International medical graduates. Also, you can talk about zoning and housing. So IMGs, you can talk about retraining, residence spots, the unmatched rate for Canadian medical graduates. Some people are like, our own medical graduates are going unmatched. So why are international medical graduates like allowed to match or something, right? So there's a lot of ideas there and arguments. Multiculturalism. So maybe someone coming in from India could provide better care to Indian patients, maybe because they understand things in a certain different way than someone who grew up here. And standards of care, because everyone's receiving their medical training in different environments. The doctor shortage, I can talk about, again, IMGs. So a lot of these, by the way, by understanding like 80% of the topics, you can start making connections to other things. So maybe you didn't study, for example, the doctor shortage too much for your interview, but then maybe you studied IMGs and you can really use that as a point, something to go deep on in your answer. You talk about mid-level providers. So in Ontario now, you have pharmacists that can prescribe, I think, up to 11 medications that you don't have to go to the doctor for anymore. So that frees up the doctor's, your family physician's time. Physician burnout, rural, and telehealth. Aging population, you can talk about the tax system, which means, you have a growing aging population and less working people. So what do you do about that? Because you got to find a way to pay for their health care, but you have less people that are working and of working age. The population structure is actually shrinking in a lot of developed countries. Telehealth, loneliness, wealth transfer, medical assisted dying, resource allocation, and quality of life. AI in healthcare. This is my, when I said I have non-traditional experiences, I've done a lot in tech. So trust me, these are some cool points to talk about. Bias, that's what everybody talks about. You can talk about natural language processing in healthcare, especially as applied to electronic health records. Talk about data security. I'm at the Mayo Clinic, which is the #1 hospital on the face of the planet. And every day there are so many cyber attacks trying to just steal data from hospitals. And there's hospitals that are being locked down. Even in Toronto, this happened last summer because of cyber attacks, cyber war, genomes, analysis of genomes using AI, quantum computing, and what that's going to bring to really, creating medicines, protein folding, a lot of really cool things you could talk about in AI that's past, the ethics stuff people read when they go to CBC Health or what is it, healthydebate.ca. In health, the quality of the AI is only as good as the input. So make sure the input's not biased and doesn't have racism. Well, cool, but that is like 10% of the ideas that you could present. Of course, that's a great idea, but there's so much more that people aren't understanding because they're not going to these other resources. And lastly, genomes, you can talk about personalized medicine, designer babies, curing disease, diagnostics and accuracy, and reinforcing bias. Cool. And again, these slides will be sent to you. Last few minutes, organization. This is about letting your amazing answers get the recognition that they deserve. So in your first answer too, I would always give an outline of what I'm going to talk about. For example, hello, I'll begin by addressing the pros and cons of implementing such a public health policy before giving my opinion and then relating it to an experience I've had in the area. This answer, if you say this like to begin your answer, it is like you're already ahead of the pack. Because everyone's either, they just start talking and then they start rambling and then they go on a tangent. And maybe you're talking in the middle of talking, you think of something, oh, that's a cool idea. And then you start talking about that. Then you forget the main point and then you don't even answer the question. So while people are busy rambling and giving incoherent answers, or maybe they're coherent, they're probably coherent, but they just don't like give an outline of what they're going to say, right? If you give this outline, you're already ahead of the pack. And plus, this person's heard the same answer to the same question 20 times. You're telling them off the bat, I'm going to relate it to an experience I've had in the area. You're already ahead of the pack. That, like, your interviewer is probably just going to be like, wow, this person is going to give me the answer that I need and some more. So it's going to be like a holiday for them. They're going to have a lot of fun times. They're going to have a lot of fun listening to your answer because they know how to follow it and they're looking for a surprise at the end. And lastly, should you give a summary statement at the end? I rarely did, but I know people who do. So it's a matter of personal style. Next, avoid extreme stances. So this should go without saying, but I'll tell you why it's more nuanced than you may think. If you're asked, should pharmaceutical companies be allowed to provide gifts? such as free samples of their latest medicinal compounds to physicians. What would you think, right? Because me personally, the first year I applied especially, I'd be like, no, pharma companies, bad, bad, bad. I don't, pharma companies are the worst. You don't want, that's a conflict of interest. You don't want the pharma companies to be giving gifts to physicians. But what about if that gift happens to be like a bunch of samples of a certain medication that is life-saving? And in Ontario and Canada, we don't have pharmacare, which means we don't have free medications. We have free medical care at point of service, but we don't have pharmacare. That's why most of us either pay for our like antibiotics ourselves, or maybe we're under our parents' insurance or our own insurance from our employer. So you could say, there are times where this could help. For example, maybe there's life-saving medications and you have a patient who can't afford it. Boom, here, take this that the pharma company gifted to me. That's gonna, help treat your chronic condition, for example, right? And on the other end, pharmaceutical companies, they serve a purpose. We use drugs all the time to treat conditions. So what if you don't learn about something that could have helped? Or what if this company now can't market and they're going to go out of business, and maybe they were a big part of the local economy? They hire people, right? Those people need to feed their families, their employees. So there's a lot of other, even if someone seems super evil, you can be mature by considering the nuances involved in their perspective. And a lot of times questions will be framed in a way to get you kind of inflamed, like, ooh, should a pharmaceutical company give gifts to physicians? So that's going to evoke a strong reaction in a lot of individuals, especially people who maybe can't control their emotions. You need to sit down and think, what's the other side of the argument, right? Because not everything is black and white. Study at night. When I was a teenager, I read this book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Teens. And it told me to study before I slept, because what you do an hour before sleeping gets replayed in your brain up to 6 times more than anything else you did that day. Now, I don't know how true that number is, but I do believe it, because, if you're on Instagram, if you're watching the news before you sleep and it's like, oh, this guy got murdered, this person, there was a shooting here, you're going to have bad sleep. If you watch a horror movie before you go to bed, you're going to have nightmares. But if you watch the horror movie, like right when you wake up, like there's a way less chance you're going to have a nightmare at night. So I would always practice for my interviews right before I slept. So that perspective-taking mindset would become ingrained into my thinking. So it wouldn't be like something I memorized for my interview. It actually became my way of thinking after practicing every single night for like a month. Also, I told you how, I tell you the resources I use. So I would go beyond. I'd look at the MIT Tech Review. I'd look at Nature Biotechnology. I would look at, I think, the Wall Street Journal. Listen to podcasts by A16Z, A16Z. That's like an investor in Silicon Valley. I would listen to so many different ideas and topics, especially the second time I interviewed, remember, because I interviewed 2 times in two cycles. And when I was answering, I could even just giggle, because I knew the basic answer that people like my peers would be thinking of when they got like an ethical question or whatever. And then I would think of all these adjacent, relating to economics, finance, technology, all these other viewpoints that I've learned that I was able to put in my answers to really go above and beyond. Okay. And next, zoom out. I think it's on Kira, the website you're using for your interviews. So sometimes if it's a longer question, you might not see the whole thing, especially on the 13-inch screen. So I would put it on 90% zoom. Share videos of your answers with colleagues. So this is a big tip, and I'll show you what I mean. So this is our website, thebrightdoctor.com, and this is our medical school interview question bank. And you can go, you can go on test mode and put it on exactly 2 minutes to think, and maybe give yourself 5 minutes to answer like you should, or maybe do 4 minutes and 30 seconds so you can practice giving your answer quicker so you don't go over time, right? And you can create a test. Should recreational cannabis consumption be legalized, right? What are some of the most important developments in medicine in the past few decades, in your opinion? This is like such a thought-provoking question that could appear on your interview. And then you have 2 minutes to think, just like what your vMPI is going to be like. Then it records you so you can give your answer, and it's whatever time you want. So especially because your questions are going to be asynchronous, your interview style is asynchronous, this is so good to record yourself and review, save your videos, and send it to friends, which is what I would do to get feedback. You can review the expert answers with ideas to go beyond and avoid. And again, this is for every single question of the hundreds in our question bank. And lastly, practice, practice, practice. There's a lot of topics that you need to not only understand at a very deep level, but be able to provide your expert opinion on in the setting of an interview. So again, these will be sent to you in the format of slides, and I want to go over, we have an Ontario Health Policy question bank with a lot of questions like the ones we've seen. For example, what strategies has Ontario employed to enhance the training and distribution of its health workforce, right? How do we manage scarce resources, opioid drug prescriptions, right? And so on and so forth. How do we address the shortage of healthcare professionals? We have other mini question banks like on the opioid crisis and healthcare. American health policy, this is huge because I did a study abroad in the United States. I did like an exchange in the United States. So in a lot of my answers, I'd be able to not only talk about what Canada's doing, what we could do, but I would talk about what America's doing. What is the Netherlands doing? What's the Bismarck system in Germany doing? What's the NHS in England doing? Have an understanding of other healthcare systems around the world, and you'll be able to provide way richer answers. Alberta health policy, understand what's going on in other provinces, okay? Telehealth, alternative medicine, that's huge. British Columbia, Manitoba, genetic testing, genome sequencing, vaccine ethics. So we have a lot of these mini question banks. That is it. I promised we'd be done within the hour, and it is 7:52. So are there any questions for us, for me, for Ron, the University of Toronto medical student? Feel free to put them in the chat.